Hello again, it's Brad Kraft. I'm a bookseller here at University Bookstore, and I have some recommendations. Today I wanted to talk about short stories. It's not my favorite form of literature, but in the hands of masters, it can be a really good read. And the first person I wanted to mention was, indeed, an American master. Now, I can't believe there was a time when O. Henry was in every single anthology of short stories, especially American short stories. He's written many famous ones, many adapted to film over and over again. The Ransom of Red Chief comes to mind, even though they don't necessarily call it that. The plot has been used many, many times since. The Gift of the Magi, a famous Christmas story involving hair and a watch fob. Much of what he's written is part of an older tradition of American humor that involves malaprop and antique words. If you want to think of an unfunny version of that, you can easily reference Lovecraft or William S. Burroughs. The funny version involves people like Ring Lardner, Damon Runyon, and even the Wayans brothers. On In Living Color, they had at least one character, a prisoner, who would very much fit into that tradition. One of the reasons I like him better than, say, Damon Runyon or Ring Lardner is that O. Henry, who had a rather troubled financial history, perhaps a bit of criminality of his own, his sympathies were entirely with working class people. The villains are invariably bankers and capitalists. Unlike, say, Mark Twain, he didn't fancy himself a capitalist, even though he made a great deal of money. Twain wasn't a very good capitalist, as it turns out. But this brief moment from The Man Higher Up, a story of three grifters coming together, tells you something of where his sympathies lay. There are two kinds of grafts, said Jeff, that ought to be wiped out by law. I mean Wall Street speculation and burglary. Nearly everybody will agree with you as to one of them, said I, with a laugh. Well, burglary ought to be wiped out too, said Jeff, and I wondered whether the laugh had been redundant. That's good. Here's an excerpt from another story, completely different in tone, also quite famous, called The Furnished Room. Everybody wrote ghost stories then. Come in, said the housekeeper. Her voice came from her throat. Her throat seemed lined with fur. I have the third floor back, vacant since a week back. Should you wish to look at it? The young man followed her up the stairs. A faint light from no particular source mitigated the shadows of the halls. They trod noiselessly upon a stair carpet that its own loom would have forsworn. It seemed to have become vegetable, to have degenerated in that rank, sunless air to lush lichen or spreading moss that grew in patches to the staircase, and was viscid under the foot like organic matter. At each turn of the stairs were vacant niches in the wall. Perhaps plants had once been set within them. If so, they had died in that foul and tainted air. Maybe that statues of the saints had stood there, but it was not difficult to conceive that imps and devils had dragged them forth in the darkness and down to the unholy depths of some furnished pit below. There are a lot of O. Henry stories. This is a great collection, 101 stories that I could recommend. One famous one, The Last Leaf, I would definitely recommend. And his last story, The Dream. Very interesting. The next book I wanted to mention was one that I only discovered again when I came back to the bookstore. And it's not by someone known, to me at least, for short stories or even for fiction. I know him primarily as a playwright, the author of 6 Characters in Search of an Author. Luigi Pirandello, Stories for the Years, translated from the Italian by Virginia Jewis. Now, it's a remarkable little book. I didn't know anything much about Pirandello, except, as I said, as a playwright, and the fact that he had, like many Italians of his generation, a somewhat troubled relationship with the fascist party. I love you, I hate you, I love you, I hate you. At any rate, this book came as a shock and a surprise and a delight, frankly. If I would say I was reminded of anything, it would be of Italo Calvino's Italian folk tales. Many of the stories in here read very much like a folk tale. The Raven of Mizaro, The Revenge of the Dog, the very first story. Spoiler alert for dog lovers, you don't want to read that story. But the structure of them and the interest in them comes from a certain così brutale. They're rough. These are peasant folk, mostly, and they are in touch, as they say, with animal nature. I would share just one little bit from a story I liked that very much fits that bill. It's called The Cat, a Goldfinch, and the Stars. It's lovely. A stone, another stone. A man goes by and sees them side by side. But what does this stone know of the one next to it, of the water, or the gully where it flows? The man sees the water and the gully, he hears the sound of the water, and begins to imagine that it confides who knows what secrets to the gully as it flows by. Oh, what a starry sky above the roofs of this poor little mountain village. Gazing from the rooftops to heaven, you swear that the stars see nothing else tonight, so brightly do they shine. And yet, the stars know nothing of the earth. Well, I mean, man knows what he's doing. Stories for the ears. Lovely. And finally, I wanted to mention a book by a contemporary writer who I knew because of his first novel called Real Life. Brandon Taylor, Filthy Animals. Now, if you're going to read a book of contemporary short stories, I have a couple of ideas. First, if you're not sure if you want to read them, always read the title story. Now, sometimes the stories are linked and they want the reader to start at the beginning and go to the end. But not always. And I find that if one story is the one they pull out to put on the front of the book, if you don't know the author, it's a lovely place to start because it'll tell you what you need to know about the style and content of the particular writer. Now, the title story here, Filthy Animals, involves teenagers. And I had what, to me, came as something of a revelation, but is probably long since understood by most people. I'm not particularly fond of adolescent protagonists. It's a long time ago for me, and a time I don't particularly want to remember. And I can't understand this devotion to 16, 17, 18-year-old central characters. And then I sort of figured it out. I'm reminded of Jane Austen and Anthony Trollope. Not that they had teenage characters as their leads, but rather because if you think about classic English novels, there are things in the way of people saying things that, if they said them, would resolve the novel or the short story very quickly. But social convention and manners prevent people from saying, "I love you," when they do. Teenagers in contemporary fiction fulfill something of the same requirement. A grown person could be expected to be able to articulate their feelings. Some of us, occasionally, if we really tried. But teenagers don't know what they're feeling. They don't know how to articulate what they're feeling. And if they do, they often get it wrong. Thus, Filthy Animals, for example. again, it's kind of rough, this story, as it should be. It involves boys, thus violence and sexual energy that they don't know where to put. But it's brilliantly achieved. It's very smart. And Mr. Taylor is capable of many moods. One of my favorite stories in it is called Little Beast, which is a nightmare of babysitting. It would be nothing, would take nothing to rend this girl to pieces. Sylvia feels in this moment like the grandmother who is part wolf. She'd gobble the little girl down and keep her there. Instead, she takes the girl's wrists and leads her into the living room. The boy sits quietly with his coloring. "Stay," Sylvia says to him when his eyes track towards them. She winds through the piles of toys and cushions. The living room resembles not so much a battlefield as one of those emptied-out neighborhoods in a dying Rust Belt town. There's a sense of order having been overrun by chaos and wreckage. Work for later, before the parents return. This is what they have been doing while they have been coloring. The sliding door is cracked open. No doubt, it is the opening the girl slipped through in order to find her little surprise. This, Sylvia thinks, is what they consider being quiet and good. Well, that's chilling, isn't it? It's also funny in a bitter way. Mr. Taylor, as I say, is capable of many moods. There's another story called Anne of Cleves about a, again, unlikely relationship. He's full of unlikely relationships. People that ought not to be together, but may not have a choice, or at least not many options. This is about a rather disastrous relationship between two women. The first time Marta met Sigrid's friends from graduate school in a downtown bar, she was surprised by how normal they looked. They weren't in tweed and collared shirts and chinos. They weren't dressed like miniature professors. They wore jeans and t-shirts and baseball caps with logos from minor teams around the Midwest. They wore boots and sneakers. They spoke in the flat, clipped way she was accustomed to, and at first she felt right in with the rhythm of their conversation, the weather, the price of gas, the merits of cheap beer and free time. Marta, in her stretch-waist pants and scuffed steel toes, felt at ease among them. She sat down next to Sigrid along the bar, her arms loosely around her shoulders, Sigrid's arm around her waist. Sometimes they'd catch each other's eye and couldn't stop from smiling. But at some point in the night, the conversation cinched in the middle, as if someone had tightened a belt around it, so that all their focus and energy had been funneled down to a point so small that Marta could barely grasp it. Something about semiotics, something about the nature of knowledge. Well, utterly unlike the other stories in some ways. He's a brilliant writer, and somebody I would genuinely recommend. If you haven't read his novel, you should, especially if short stories aren't your particular boogie. Anyway, there are 3 books of short stories, all of them grand. Read a few. Talk to you later. Bye.